Good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Hiddleston, and today I'll be facilitating what I hope will be a very exciting panel discussion and presentation around not only how we survived through COVID and started the recovery, but ultimately looked for the opportunities as New Zealand to take advantage of the increasing pace of change that China will bring and the opportunities for the New Zealand economy. In my role, looking after the commercial and agri sector at ANZ, I'm in a really privileged position to deal with entrepreneurs and the privately owned business community. And I, for one, saw as lockdown hit how they didn't just sit and cry, they actually got on with it. When the harvest is ready, it has to come in. It has to get to the port and has to get to those markets that over many, many years New Zealand business have developed, and they wanted to meet those commitments. Today, Charles, Jade and David will walk through some of the strategies that they and their companies put in place to not only deal with COVID and survive, but ultimately pivoted and took advantage to make sure that we grow and seize the opportunity, which is a growing Chinese nation. We've just heard that China isn't just open. They are very keen to continue to grow as a powerhouse on the world stage. So the things we need to be thinking about is sort of what's been accelerated, what's been disrupted, what are no longer the non-negotiables, but also what is no longer necessary. Charles, can I ask you to hop up first? Charles Finny is New Zealand Trade and Enterprise Director and former New Zealand Deputy Chef de Mission to Beijing and New Zealand's representative to Taiwan. He has worked on many New Zealand trade agreements and now advises the private sector, the New Zealand government and other governments around the world on a range of policy issues. He is a regular media commentator and delivers guest lectures on trade policy and domestic politics at universities in New Zealand and internationally. I also understand you've been educating some of our New Zealand politicians on the ways of dealing with trade in China. Welcome to the stage, Charles.
Thank you very much, and on that latter point, I try. Good morning, everyone. Zao an, daja hao, kia ora tātou. Thank you very much first to Michael Barnett and Fran O'Sullivan for arranging this event. The turnout is fantastic, and for me it is wonderful to see. I go back in the relationship a very long time. Not as long as some in the room, I note, but I recall relatively recently, like within the last 30 years, having arguments with the precursor to Fonterra about the China market and being told that the Chinese don't like dairy products and it's never going to be a huge market, and to meat companies who told me that Chinese don't like eating sheep meat. And so it's wonderful to see that those preconceptions have been disproved and that the China market is thriving. Now, normally when I stand up to talk about most things, I start with a disclaimer saying that I'm making personal views and that these are not the views of any organisation that I'm associated with, but today is different. These views are formally being made on behalf of New Zealand Trade and Enterprise. I've been a director of NZTE for 11 years, and I'm kind of hoping that maybe this is the last year because it's a bit of a record, but I've enjoyed that time enormously, and I'm enormously proud of what NZTE has achieved, particularly in recent years. Now at NZTE, we like to pride ourselves on having a very robust risk management process. Indeed, I chaired the NZTE Audit and Risk Committee for many years, just finished a month ago. But I have to confess that a global pandemic of the scale that we are currently navigating was not sitting at the top of our register. It's now there, but it didn't get there until late January. And when it first became a focus for us, we were thinking of it purely in terms of China. Now, of course, it has got global reach. But when we first focused, we had to initially think about what this would mean for our over 70 strong staffing across China. Then we had to think about what the impact was going to be on the China market and on our customers, all the time remembering that China is our major goods export market and a vitally important source of services, trade, and also imports. And then, as things have developed, obviously, we've been focusing on what the implications are for the wider region and our global operation. So as it was for MFAT, the initial reaction of NZTE was the welfare of our staff. And it was complicated by the fact that our staff are, in some cases, New Zealand-based staff sent overseas, and we have a very large number of Chinese employees as well. And this all hit at the same time as Chinese New Year, just to make things even more complicated. So we moved very, very quickly, within a couple of days, to a work from home, work online, work remote model. So our Chinese employees were very quickly enabled to work from home. We ensured that they had as much PPE equipment as possible, sanitizers, food, and we understood that they were in a very difficult situation because schools were closed, the supermarkets were difficult to reach. Their world was turned upside down by a very strict lockdown in many places. And we brought our New Zealand seconded staff back to New Zealand. They continued with their roles, but they were working remotely from New Zealand. In terms of our customers, we saw very major impacts immediately in terms of the closure of some channels to market. For example, hotels and restaurants were closed. And we saw in some product areas immediate impacts as well. We heard this morning about the immediate impact on forestry products as well. So once we were confident in the safety of our staff, we then focused on how best to focus on our customers. And this was all hitting at peak export season. So the fruit was ripening on the vines and trees, and we had very major, large numbers of, there's obviously meat processing going on, large quantities, and a lot of dairy product to export. We tried to be as fully operational as possible. We focused initially on as much online presentation work as we could. We enhanced our market intelligence offering to our customers, and we focused even more intensively on e-commerce than we had in the past. We did actually have a big focus on e-commerce in the China market, but that work was enhanced greatly. And we found ourselves in the initial periods being a major air freight operator, which is something that NZTE has not had to do much of in the past. So working with the Ministry of Transport and a number of airlines around the world, we were responsible for assisting with 200 flights focused on air freight for a high-value perishable product. Fortunately, the China market held up very well, and our staff stayed safe, and the problem has been less of a China problem than a global problem in recent months. But there are some sectors that have been impacted in terms of China. Forestry, initially because of backlogs in China, global trends, and then our own level 4 lockdown has been hit quite obviously, but has recovered quickly. Seafood has been a challenging area to be trading in, and unfortunately the second wave of outbreak in Beijing in a marketplace associated with seafood has not been helpful, and the wine export market has been impacted because the Chinese are not as good at consuming wine at home as we are in New Zealand, and so with restaurants shut, it's been a much slower business. I'm pleased to say that all our staff are now back in China, and we're operating from the offices around China, so it is as much business as usual as we can make it. We've had a major rethink about what this means for NZTE, and we've done this a couple of times while I've been on the board, and we're now back into a focus on another internal transformation. We're, as the Minister said earlier on today, doubling the size of customers receiving intensive support, so we're focusing on 700. It's now going to be double that number, close to double that number. We're focusing much more intensively on our digital offering. And new ways of providing support in market. Now, this is still work in progress, but as the Minister alluded to it, I'll happily speak to it. A lot of you can't travel to conduct the negotiations, to promote the product that in the way that you used to. Some of that can be online, but you will need people on the ground to help you, and we're thinking about how we can enhance our offering to be more helpful to you in that regard. We've also focused intensively on our domestic New Zealand offering. We've greatly increased the amount of support available through the regional business partnership process. We've been running training sessions on business continuity planning, cash flow clinics, and that work will be continuing. We've focused intensively on the what this means for the Chinese consumer and consumer behaviours. I commend that to each of you in this room because there have been changes. Obviously, more people are doing more purchasing online, but the whole focus, particularly in the food and beverage area in China, is more intensively on product integrity. And this offers an enormous opportunity for New Zealand if we continue to play things well. New Zealand wide, we are focusing on a refresh of the New Zealand story. You're seeing the first stages of this rolling out now, but this is something that is going to be continuing over the next few months. And I hope you follow it, because hopefully your own branding and marketing stories can piggyback off that messaging. So it's been an extremely challenging time. Luckily, China has recovered, and our staff have all stayed well, and most of you are continuing to trade relatively normally, and in many cases have increased your exports to China. But we're going to have to be working extremely closely with you, we know, over the next year or so, because it is going to remain a challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles, and look forward to hearing more about the New Zealand story, because it's a good one and the world needs to hear it. Our next speaker is David. That's not Davo, it's David. Is the Chief Grower and Alliances Officer at Zespri International. And if there's a company that's had to deal with a virus in the past, it's Zespri. As we went into lockdown, the season was just beginning. So, David, over to you.
Thank you, and thanks also to Fran for the invite for this, well, now this afternoon I think we're into. I just want to start by just giving a little bit of context. I'm talking about what we've learnt to date in terms of how to manage the business in COVID. And things are going pretty well for us, but I'm very conscious this thing has a long, long way to go to play out. And as a result of that, we know there are challenges to come our way that we've thought about. and also challenges that we haven't thought about that we're going to have to navigate. And so by hopefully saying those comments at the start, I avoid the commentator's curse of standing in front of you and saying things are going good for things to turn to custard tomorrow. So hopefully I've done that with that proviso. During crisis, and we've dealt with a few in our industry, what you know is that it's really good to anchor yourself to a set of priorities. That when you are faced with a multiple of choices that you have to make, that you can make decisions and refer back to a frame of priorities. What are we going to do on this particular situation where there's different things to think about? So in the case of COVID, our three priorities were supporting and protecting our people. In the end, we're asking around about 600 staff, half of them in New Zealand and half of them around the world in 20-odd countries, to deliver our season largely from their homes, home offices, their lounges, or their kitchen tables and sort of apartments and houses around the world. So making sure they felt safe and felt supported with the tools and technology, that they weren't forced to be in situations where they felt uncomfortable was critical to us, so they felt they could perform. It'll be fair to say when our fruit started arriving into market, our staff felt really good about that because finally they had something they could grip onto, particularly up in some of our offshore markets in Europe, for instance, after a lot of uncertainty and change for a long period of time. And they've delivered the season largely from their homes, so they've done a fantastic job. The second priority for us was delivering the season. In the end, in the fruit business, you get one crack at it every year, and if it goes wrong, actually the implications of that can play out for a number of years afterwards, because the cash flow you use from that year clearly sets up your crop for years to come. The third area was around building our business for the future. One thing we learnt during PSA is that when you're thinking about survival, sometimes you make choices and decisions to turn off long-term investments, because you've just got your head in the game for today. And we were about to, and still are about to, embark on a significant redesign, rebuild of all of our systems within Zespri. And so we're trying to make sure we do not just sort of knee-jerk and turn that off for fear of what's coming our way. We want to try and get the balance right between building for the future and managing the business today as well. I'm going to focus on the first two priorities, talk broadly around what we've done and also specifically about China. When COVID struck, it actually struck us at a time in the markets that is generally our quietest time of year. So we were quite fortunate in that regard. Unfortunately, it struck us onshore at the busiest time of the year because we were into harvest. And in fact, we'd just packed away our first ship a week before New Zealand went into lockdown. So we still had about 90-odd% of our crop to go. So that was sort of our context for running the season as it was. As we saw COVID step first from China and then across the world into Europe, some of our key markets, key growing locations like Italy were severely impacted, Spain, they went into really heavy lockdowns, into the US as well. What it did is it allowed us to sort of slowly learn from each one of those experiences and shut offices down around the world and try and set up for hunkering down and just getting on with it. And so we did have quite a lead in time, like a number of the other speakers have spoken about, as you saw the spot fires flare up around the world. We took to meetings online like everyone else. We kept the team updated through constant online communication. We had online town halls across our business, and most importantly with our growers here in New Zealand. And we actually released a forecast range in March, which we've never ever done so early. Because what we're trying to do is give some sort of context for people thinking about their own businesses around what is going to be the impact on my cash flow. It was a very wide range, but nevertheless, it gave folk a view of what we thought the floor could be to our returns. And we actually then updated that range every month as we started to get a sight of the impact on the markets. Thankfully, to date, we've managed to lift the floor and the ceiling a little bit of our ranges and narrow them up a bit as well. And so because at the start, everyone was trying to grasp onto something to get a sense of what was it going to mean to me. And so frequent online communication with growers was critical, basically beaming in our staff from around the world, from their home office or home lounge into growers' lounges here in New Zealand, where they could talk quite openly and quite frankly about what they were seeing. And it did really help settle minds around how the season was going to go in front of us. We commenced our contingency planning very early on, and in fact we made decisions to reallocate some of our volumes of fruit around the world. So we run a global planning process, and so we started to get a feel for what markets we thought might be a bit bumpy, what markets we thought might go a bit better, and we could start to reallocate fruit early and make some decisions early around China, for instance, and how much fruit we wanted to put in there and what channels we wanted to go into there. And then, of course, when the alert level came here in New Zealand, and we were given the privilege to continue operating through that, and it was a privilege and something we were deeply focused on maintaining the rules as an industry. Certainly the industry worked incredibly closely together to deliver a season. We actually learnt from our Italian colleagues in the pack houses up in Italy, because in pack houses you stand fairly close to each other as the fruit's coming through, and they'd already got their head around how to operate in that environment by building petitions between their staff. And so some of those ideas were sent back to us here in New Zealand for ways to learn, and then the pack houses here implemented the same thing. And the community worked very closely together to make sure that people were following the rules. And if they weren't, we certainly heard about it. If they weren't, local police officers would phone us and say, hey, we've seen X, Y and Z with their behaviour's not the best. Can you please go and tell them? So there was a real community effort to make sure everyone stayed on track. It certainly added cost and complexity to our business right the way across, but we still kept operating through it, which was fantastic. And so we've managed to pick 100% of our crop, and it set us up very well for the season ahead. Of course, once the fruit is picked, you've then got to think about the logistics of shipping, and we had to move our minds quite quickly towards shipping and towards how we're going to get it to market. And I know one of our key shipping partners is here today, and we have very strong relationships with those people. We're lucky in that we have our own charter vessels to take fruit to market via reefer vessels, and that gave us quite a strong degree over shipping. Timing to leave, timing on the water, which ports to go to on the way to their final destination. And so we increased the number of charter ships we were using. In China, we found our key terminal for early ship season arrivals was running normally, and so we didn't experience any of that clogging you found with container ports around the place, and allowed us to bypass some of that. So it gave us a great degree of agility and flexibility. And then once you've landed the fruit, obviously you've got to sell it, which was our other challenge. It's involved a huge degree of adaptability. One of our key tools for selling our product every year is to get in the consumer's face in the supermarket with tastings, and for those who have seen it, it's a pretty impressive song and dance show. For those that have seen the Zespri sort of big walls of fruit and singing and dancing in supermarkets around the world, we couldn't do that this year. And so we had to pivot and think about, well, how now are we going to get to the consumer? What tools will we use to get to the consumer now that we can't get right in front of them at the point of sale? And so the team have thought very deeply about that, social media, etc., and how they can get in front of the consumer. Of course, we've shifted our emphasis on marketing, and it's always been a key part of our marketing around health messaging. But we know from all of our Google Analytics and all of our work that consumers are hungry for information about sources of vitamin C. And so we've really pushed that message. It's always been there, but we've really put it to the top of what we've done. That's helped us drive sales in most of our markets, this idea of healthy reading. In China in particular, we have shifted our portions of where our fruit goes. So typically 50% of our fruit in wholesale, and last year just under 15% of our fruit in e-commerce. This year, over 20% of our fruit through e-commerce channels and less through wholesale. And I think that'll be a long-term change to one of Mark's opening comments. The emphasis will shift more and more to that way. So retailers such as JD.com, Pagoda and Hema have really allowed us to drive sales in China through the online channels. Another thing we've learned is our decision to move to import of record in China back in 2016, which was already sort of tracking us to know our customers and consumers better, has really served us well this year because you're so much closer to those key people. There's so few less people between you to get the signals back from customers and consumers around the world to make choices and have flexibility in what you're doing to deliver the product. The final point I'll make is that Zespri spent quite a bit of time as a company working together to come up with a purpose that our staff sort of resonated with them and they believed in. Our purpose is to help people, communities and the environment thrive through the goodness of kiwi fruit. And actually what we've seen as we've gone through this year is that staff are sort of circling back to that, to our purpose, and what does it mean for what we're doing. And so this year, by way of example, as staff, both here in New Zealand and offshore as well, are looking at ways to donate back to frontline workers, whether it's health or whether it's money. Here in New Zealand, we've given away 100 tonnes of kiwi fruit to food banks, for example. In China, they donated fruit and provided financial assistance to support frontline workers, young children and senior citizens. And so we're very conscious that while things are going well, it's critical that we do give back at the same time. And that has been quite a rallying call and something the staff have felt very good about, that they're working hard, but they realise they can also give back as well. So purpose certainly has driven us through what we've done. So to date, it's been a mammoth effort in the industry. We're about just over 40% of our crops sold. We recognise there's bumps in the road to come, most certainly, and a few lessons learnt to date, and no doubt a few more to be learnt along the way. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And I can say, given a number of my customers that grow for Zespri, your ability to keep the harvest moving and get it delivered and giving them that confidence and certainty around what they'll be paid certainly was very well received. And congratulations on keeping an eye on the strategic, but also embracing your purpose and the community. It's great stories I think we can all learn from. Our next speaker, Jade Gray, is the founder of Gung Ventures in China. Arriving in China in 1996, I'm sure China was a very different place than it is today, given the pace of change that great nation takes place. He's had various roles across the food chain, from cattle breeding, food processing, and even retail butchery, for the likes of McDonald's and Costco. In 2003, that wasn't enough, so he set out on an entrepreneurial journey that culminated with restaurant group Gung Ho Ventures, owning several award-winning food and beverage brands, including Gung Ho Pizza and Pyro Pizza chains, the former becoming China's first food and beverage certified B corporation. He sold the group in 2019 and returned home to New Zealand. Jade has served as a NZTE Beachheads advisor, assisting a number of New Zealand companies, and also helps to support the training of Kiwis and civil servants in the ways of dealing with China. Jade.
Tēnā koutou, daja zhōng hao. Good afternoon. It's great to be here because I was asked by the organisers to maybe share some insights I've had as an entrepreneur in China for the last 20, 25 years, and what I've seen happening in market and what relevance that now has in a kind of a COVID world. So we've got a presentation here we'll try and kick off. There we go. So the area I want to focus on is, I think, something very dear to New Zealand, which is protein. And in this case, alternative protein. And I'm going to hone in on the meat alternative protein. And that, just to clarify what meat alternative protein is, this is plant-based meats, lab-cultivated meats is the major movers in the space. I guess to get a snapshot of what's happening currently in the space and why I think it's really relevant and is going to have a huge disruption across the world, and obviously I believe in New Zealand, is to go back to where my perception was formed. And that was when I first arrived into China in 1998 in the back of a 747 with 280 Angus cattle, putting a new definition on cattle class. And that was a first job I had in China, graduating from university in Chinese, was to go and run a Angus cattle breeding operation that was a joint venture between New Zealand and China up in the Chinese northeast. And at that point, China had just become the world's largest meat consumer. And now we've moved in those 20-odd years. When I left China, it is now by far the largest and occupies around about 28% of the world's meat consumption. So for the next 16, 17 years, I worked in the meat sector, food supply chain. But it was in 2016 that I read something which completely stopped me in my tracks. And I'd like to look at that as a catalyst for the movement we're seeing today. And what that was that the government announced in 2016 that the dietary guidelines in China were going to be changed, and they had a goal of reducing meat consumption in half by 2030. This is on the back of concerns the party had around climate change, food security, population growth, and public health with diabetes, etc. So this is kind of a major point of somebody in the meat industry. And they kicked it off with a $300 million deal with Israel, exploring cultivated meats in 2017. At the other end of town, you had online the millennials and the Generation Zers who were pushing for change and wanting a new solution in their diet for protein. And by a research done by Mintel in 2017, they noted that 39% of those surveyed said they'd eaten less meat year on year. And if we go back to the numbers and the scale in reference to Greg's comments earlier this morning, that represents around about 550 million people had decided to eat less meat. In response to that, as an entrepreneur, in our restaurants, we kicked off our own formulated dairy mozzarella, dairy-free mozzarella, and meat-free pepperoni meats that we processed in store. And it was that point that I got quite engaged with this community in China and kind of who was pushing this. And a big part of that was we noticed sales jumped to 30% of our pizza sales in around about 6 months using alternative proteins. So leading into the next stage, which we saw was a real step change in the industry. And that came about in 2018. And I saw 3 things that dramatically changed the landscape. The first was the African swine fever. And this completely decimated the Chinese pig industry, killing around about, or dying or culled, around about 350 million pigs, about a quarter of the world's population of pigs. And the bad press that went with that, and there was questions around livestock as being virus carriers, and this started the conversation we saw online and offline. Another stakeholder that moved around a similar time was the government's challenges with the trade war. And a huge part of the animal feed into China is on soybean imported from the United States of America. So with this deteriorating situation, China rightly was concerned about the impacts that having a stop of soy import as well as other feed produce coming into China, hence looking towards other solutions outside of animal protein. The third event that we saw, which really brought the business investors and entrepreneurs to the table, was the Beyond Meat IPO, which was in 2019. And that was the biggest IPO one-day gain in close to 20 years on the NASDAQ. So it was at that point that the Chinese business community really, I guess, perked up the idea that there's a lot of potential in this space. With those 3 stakeholders coming together, we noticed that by January 2020, the Asia alternative protein space was complete, from investors to producers to end users. And it was really that ecosystem which was formed. And I guess in hindsight, that's what's allowed what I would consider to be a tipping point in the whole alternative protein space in China. Covid-19 really made consumers rethink their diets. And the challenge was that most of the epicenters and most of the news coming across in China was typically based around wet markets and had to do with either seafood or meat proteins. So straight away there was a lot of bad press, and a lot of the footage were from archaic wet markets that are a huge part of the food chain in China. And recently the second spike in Beijing was from the Xinfadi beef and lamb market in Beijing, was part of that problem. So it's basically had a lot of bad press, and a lot of people were starting to think, what does my diet look like? And there's been a huge movement towards vegetarian and flexitarian diets. And just anecdotally, I've got friends who are in Beijing, entrepreneurs, and they're all talking about how they're moving their families and their own diets more towards a plant-based flexitarian diet. From this, we noticed that the big brands in town jumped on this. And due to their preparation in 2019, when the movement was already building, they were in a prized position to jump on this movement. And so in April, when all the restaurants finally reopened and supermarket retail, they are all good to go, offering very compelling alternative meat solutions. And the main one at this point being Beyond Meats, who launched into Starbucks, KFC, Taco Bell, Pizza Hut in a matter of about 2 weeks, and is now across 10,000 stores just in these brands alone. And with that, we see the uptake of Chinese brands following this. And so the very influential Hippo Fresh supermarket chain, you've got Haiti, they have also recently launched alternative protein solutions. And you'll see from the branding with Starbucks, which in my opinion really are the benchmark when it comes to food and beverage marketing and business in China. Their program is called Good Good. And they're really pitching alternative proteins as being a healthier solution and a way to solve your concerns that you may have around traditional, conventional protein. So what we've seen has really been a massive shift, and I would close to say a disruption already happening in market on the back of these last 5 years, which has come to point now. As an entrepreneur, how have I responded? Well, I guess as entrepreneurs do, you just jump in the game rather than try and push back on the trend. So a big part of moving back to New Zealand has been to set up a New Zealand solution to our Asian export markets around alternative proteins, and with a real Asian nuanced customer insights using what I'd like to think a lot of food tech and data to drive our decision making. With that, I feel we as an industry, and when I look at an industry, I'm talking about protein, not necessarily dairy, meat, or seafood, but really how do we face this? Because there's an incredible opportunity. How often does the world's greatest producer of protein have a chance to expand at a whole new market? And that's really the opportunity we have here. If you look at the technologies coming on tap, we're basically now competing against Silicon Valley, Zhongguancun. All of these technology companies are now competing with our Agri business. This is an example of an Israeli company which is 3D printing plant-based meats. And I know that may be a bit of a hard pill to swallow, but the fact is this has many compelling solutions for concerned consumers. With traceability, there is obviously they can, with the environmental footprints of a lot of these plant-based ingredients, we're also seeing there's a big attraction in terms of business when you look at things like disruption to food chains. Given that you can potentially print a steak in around about 2 minutes versus grow one in 2 to 3 years. Logistics with huge populations in China, when you can have these facilities in the middle of the market producing plant-based meats, you have biofood reactors, you can have obviously your printing and other solutions for such as cell-cultivated meats. So this is the world we're facing. I see in the last 20 years this slowly evolve, and now looking at what does that look like in the next 20 years. In terms of the size, obviously the demand for protein is going to continue to grow as more and more move to middle class and population explodes around Asia and continues to grow in China. But what we're going to see is it's going to be broken up differently in terms of who's getting that share. And so there's going to be competition between cultured meats, plant-based meats, and traditional meats. And so how does New Zealand again position that? And I think the great approach we need to take is how do we continue our proud tradition of being the world's most trusted protein producer? And if we take this mindset, this offers an incredible opportunity for the wider New Zealand dairy, meat, seafood sectors. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jade. And certainly a bit of a wake-up call for the opportunity for New Zealand in terms of the changing market and the pace of that change. No one in this room could say we didn't see it coming, but when you see some of the statistics and the scale of those changes, it's something we really do need to wake up to as a proud exporting nation. Right, the floor is open for Q&A. But I might just start, if that's okay. Throughout, certainly Charles and David, your session, communication seemed to be important. So would you mind just sort of elaborating a little bit more around how communication was vital over the last couple of months, but what did you learn from that?
For us, it was you probably can't communicate enough. Certainly in those early days, you can feel the anxiety in our industry by the number of phone calls I get generally, and the number of phone calls our directors and other management get. And you could hear people just wanted something concrete to try and start to make sense of things in those early days. And so with that, for as long as that anxiety was there, we were communicating as much as we could, whether it was online or through written communication from the chairman, from Dan, our CEO, from others in the business. My team, my grower-facing team, were proactively phoning growers just to say g'day and how are you going. And occasionally you got some nice traffic back the other way. Occasionally we get a grower phone me and go, mate, I know you're working incredibly long hours for us. How are you going? How's the family? So certainly the communication from a functional perspective, telling people what was going on was great, but also from just looking out for each other was fantastic as well. And so as the industry has got more confidence in how the season is going, we're not going quite as much the same tempo, but we recognise we have to keep it going and using new tools to do it as well have worked really well for us.
I endorse all those comments. The organisation-wide communication, absolutely essential, but also team communication as much as possible is the way to go. What was interesting was learning how much could actually be done by using different vehicles, and bad news for Air New Zealand again, sorry, but how much can be done without as much face-to-face and as much travel as we used to. But actually, I think NZTE has been quite innovative in that space already, and this has just accelerated existing processes.
Okay, thank you. And I saw that for myself, with Antonia in terms of communicating with our 8,500 staff. They really did value the communication, but it had to be different styles, right? You had to show empathy. People working from home, try to bring up their kids, teach them or not, was vital. Okay, we've got a question here from Richard Lofhagen. What changes have been made or lessons learned to risk management processes in the supply chain as a result of COVID? That's probably a good one for you.
For us, I spoke a bit about our shipping's a good example about how you build agility and flexibility into your supply chain. So you do have the ability to make choices when things don't go right for you around moving. Certainly having a very flexible approach to your market S&OP planning and your ability to change and push volume to different markets around the world. So getting that information back in real time from the world so you can make choices, because we make choices to push product to different parts of the world, but you have to make it several weeks in advance for obvious reasons, because you've got your shipping time to work your way through. So two key things here around how you build the ability to be agile in your supply chain, quite critical and probably not so obvious to us at the time, but certainly very obvious to us now around how we can try and keep that element in our supply chain going forward.
Looks like there's one for you there, Charles. How do we tell or sell the authentic New Zealand story in China without the context of the New Zealand landscape or its people?
Well, I think we can still sell a story with lots of imagery, and so we can do quite a lot without actually having people travelling between our two countries. But I just see this as an enormous opportunity, not just for telling the story in China, but speaking globally. The amount of coverage and positive coverage that New Zealand has received in recent months is incredible, and the general reaction internationally has been a positive one. So if we're trying to sell a story which is based around being the the producer of highest integrity of a number of product and services to provide to China and the world, we've got a wonderful backdrop as a result of what has been achieved in terms of response to COVID-19. So watch this space. I mentioned the New Zealand story before. There is a new phase of messaging coming out any day based around exactly that, and focus in particular on food and beverage.
Thanks, Charles. Jade, there's one there for you. What is required to take advantage of cultured meats in New Zealand?
Yeah, I think there, number one, needs to be a acceptance in New Zealand that there is a huge market there for us. And if we can leverage this incredible IP we have in biotechnology, agri-tech, just good key ingenuity in terms of producing the best meats in the world. So I think that's a mental shift, and we saw that challenged when Air New Zealand launched an Impossible Burger a couple of years ago, and the kind of the outrage that caused in New Zealand. And I think we need to really ask ourselves, is that the continued, I guess, viewpoint we want to take? Secondly, I think is we need to really build capability around protein isolation from plant-based, more in particular, because that's really where the competitive advantage lies. We're never going to compete with yellow pea or soy from the States or Australia, but how could New Zealand compete making world-class proteins out of seaweed, out of pasture, out of alfalfa, and places we can really compete? And I think that'll be a key part of it, and obviously the capex that goes into that in the early stages.
Interesting. Have we got any questions on the floor? I don't see any. Yep. This gentleman at the back.
Good afternoon. Pierre Smolders from Alibaba. Thank you for your sharing and your insights. Just a question, probably for all of you, is how to play New Zealand's COVID-free status or not. It's a difficult one in terms of food safety. Is one question. The second is, are any of you concerned about the Chinese consumer concerns about food products? We've seen it with seafood particularly, that Chinese consumers are worried about the risk that the food products arrive with COVID on the packaging or in the container. So I guess that they're related questions. So, should New Zealand play on this kind of COVID-free status either overtly or subconsciously? And then are you worried about the consumer fears of imported food, particularly, I guess, fresh food?
So, second question first. It'll be fair to say when we saw the outbreak in Beijing linked to salmon, our hearts sank. And so we watched that very closely and how the dialogue kicked off on that. And it was very good to see that shut down very quickly. And so, of course, any link, proven or otherwise, hopefully never proven, that associates fresh food to COVID or a carrier of COVID would be very tough for us to overcome. So hopefully people make or use responsible language whenever they find outbreaks in places like wet markets as to how it might have got there. On the other one, I think as a company would be reluctant to push the COVID-free, push the COVID-free too hard, because it may flare up again. Hopefully it doesn't, but it may flare up again and it could box us into a corner. But certainly, being known as a producer of safe food and having really good systems absolutely plays in the background for us, both here in New Zealand, and we also grow offshore too, in Italy, France, Japan and Korea. So having being able to show confidence that you are within a bigger system to produce safe food is critical, regardless of what's happening any time of the year, COVID or not.
I think it depends a lot on what products one's talking about and also what services one is trying to promote. I can see a huge opportunity if things stay as they are in the international education space. For a Chinese parent, the safety of their child or children is enormously important, and New Zealand having a COVID-free status and with international students perhaps beginning again to arrive next year, I can see an enormous marketing opportunity. But I think it's more just the we would be promoting the New Zealand system and the integrity of that system and the strengths of our ability to respond to challenges like this that we will be selling, as opposed to necessarily COVID-free status in a number of goods areas.
Yeah, just to reiterate those points, and I think that's the key here is that we're selling a true story, which New Zealand has a very long history of transparency, traceability, integrity, and just, as I think it was Greg mentioned, just good culture that people want to step up and take ownership. And if we can leverage those stories from the past, from previous crises or whatnot, into the current story, it builds that trust. And if it does flare up, no problem. We've got the systems and the people and the protocols to deal with it. I think that's more a deeper connection with the consumer than saying we're COVID-free, because there are going to be other countries slowly becoming COVID-free. But we've got a lot deeper story to tell.
Anything else on the floor?
Thank you. This is Mohammed Hikmet. I'm the chairman of HMI Technologies and EY New Zealand Entrepreneur of the Year. Unlike many here, we partner with China as a partner, not as a market. We see China as a partner. Supported by ATID 2 years ago, we've managed to get partnership with a city in China and to produce autonomous vehicle. We are in the high-tech industry. And during COVID-19, we saw that suddenly at the time when we were just about to produce the vehicles, the lockdown happened. And we had the major contracts in Korea and other places. So we have, Mark and Jade, you both mentioned the opportunity. And we saw the opportunity there, and actually NZTE took the opportunity there and changed the way that they've done their work and have been our staff there in Korea and the market and help along with MFAT. My question here is that here we are seeing that this is an opportunity, and working horizontal across the stakeholders showed immediate benefit from getting benefit back. When can we see others who can join the team New Zealand, all Team New Zealand, where we see banks, for example, joining the same thing? Because businesses are taking risks, are going outside the boundaries, and this is not necessarily the area where, for example, banks are interested or other stakeholders in New Zealand. Thank you.
I think this is a very good point, and thank you for that feedback on NZTE's assistance to you. But I've been very impressed this morning hearing from the CEO of ANZ Bank, from the CEO of Air New Zealand, and the CEO of Fonterra, a strong message that those large corporations are there for the wider New Zealand community as well. It's not just relying on MFAT and NZTE advice, and that is very, very good to hear. And I'm sure that there are other large corporates in the room that would be only too willing to share their experiences and provide advice where that is relevant. So very good to hear. It hasn't always been the case, I have to stress, over the last 40 years, but it's very good to hear such a commitment today.
Thanks, Charles. And look, on behalf of actually the banking industry, there's nothing like a crisis to actually get you to unite and work together, and I mean this in a very safe and positive way. The first 5 weeks of lockdown, I would have probably done 120 Zoom calls with my colleagues with the Reserve Bank and Treasury as we looked to provide liquidity, additional funding, and the protection for our customers to ensure that they could survive through a real tough period. And I think that's the culture of New Zealand. And I think if we can take some of those learnings and take that to the world stage, then we can take advantage of the opportunities that we've heard today from these gentlemen, and also some of the disruptive measures that, if we don't take the opportunities, could actually be to our detriment. Got any other calls there? Stephen.
Stephen Boyce from ANZ. My question is for David. Firstly, David, congratulations for the way you've managed this crisis so far. Appreciate it's still a long way to go, but I appreciate, the PSA crisis was very different to COVID, but were there any learnings that you took away from PSA which helped your business adapt, transform to deal with this current crisis?
Certainly, one I reflected on when I was talking, that one around making sure you don't, and sort of the fear of survival, that you don't, or you're very careful to switch off longer term business investments. Now, of course, it may well be prudent if your cash flow completely crashes, as we heard from Greg today, but you just have to sort of get it right, get the balance right between focus on this year to continuing to do some of those longer term investments, because if you switch those off, they typically take a long time to switch back on again. because you want to have confidence that the recovery curve is actually for real. And so just trying to get that balance right. And the second one is around communication and looking out for people. During PSA, the industry put an enormous effort to make sure everyone was good and look after each other. The pastoral care was critical, and certainly through this period now, there were growers whose balance sheets may not be as good as their neighbours, who were pretty stressed about COVID. And so maybe to have sort of cups of tea or virtual phone calls and things with them just to reassure them that we're doing everything we can and give a sense of perspective, not gilding the lily, but realistic expectations and setting them was quite critical because it's pretty hard when you're sitting on the orchard in lockdown in Te Puke to understand what's happening out in the world. So having that link to the market was quite critical.
Okay, I'm just going to wrap up with one last question I'd hope each of you can answer. And it's something that I'd noticed and experienced was the pace of decision making and I suppose the empowerment to make decisions. Have you got any reflections on how that has played out for each of you or your teams over the last few months?
Okay, so this is not a comment I'm making on behalf of NZTE. It's me. But for me, the lockdown period was kind of challenging. I was by myself with my cat that loved lockdown. But I have an international client base, and so I was operating all hours I was awake, 7 days a week, right through. It was a very, very busy period for me. But in terms of New Zealand issues, there were numerous issues. We were so close to closing down bits of the supply chain because of people not quite thinking through the consequences of regulation that had been introduced. We were very lucky to get through as we did. But what I noticed was that we were immediately dealing at the most senior levels of government agencies and departments and with ministers direct on a lot of issues. To a person, everyone was in a how can we solve this problem mode, and that interaction was absolutely excellent. And as it happened, one of the ministers I was dealing with very regularly, who gets a very bad press, is Minister Twyford, and he couldn't have been more helpful and decisive, and we got everything sorted real fast. So it was very encouraging. The challenge now is to keep that going now that we're not at level 4 and we're having to work with a wider bureaucracy. And I have already noticed a bit of a change, but we can do it, and let's try and keep in that solving problem mode.
Yeah, I think a lot of my insights right now are still based in China because a lot of the teams I'm working with are still right in the thick of the fight. Right, and actually, you'd almost argue they're doing it tougher now because after the first wave, you kind of feel it's done, and you kind of get a little bit optimistic. And then for my friends with restaurants in Beijing, they've been hammered again, which will probably, I'd say, take at least half of those businesses out of business. But what we've noticed is senior leadership moving towards the trenches, especially in my industry, getting close to customers, suppliers, teams, providing a lot of moral support. A lot of mental health we talked about today and the challenges that everybody has in the back of that. And also what we've really taken to heart, I think, especially in China, I think we forget how many of these crises China has been through in recent times. To them, and nothing on the scale of this, understandably, but I would almost argue they just kind of went into crisis mode, which they're very used to. And whether it's been regional crisis, industry crisis, when you take that many people out of poverty in such a short time and restructure a whole country, there's going to be a lot of collateral damage, there's going to be a lot of change, uncertainty, and Chinese are very resilient to change. And so I think when COVID's come on the spot, we're seeing that speed of execution, moving on very quickly, very pragmatic Chinese approach, and hence we're seeing it in numbers. I mean, Q2 in China was outstanding, and say Q3 will be better again. I think it's that speed. And lastly, I'd say this attitude of done, not perfect. And people are very much now empowering the front line to make the decision. And how do you make a good decision with imperfect information, which was a big takeaway I got out of SARS.
Probably for us, we're part of a fairly big and complex ecosystem, Zespri, post-harvest growers and others. So the first probably lesson for us was just to make sure you're focusing on what you should focus on. Everyone is trying to focus on the area, and don't try and wander out and try and think you've got a better idea over here. So stick to your area and your area of expertise. And then the second one is around how you get the balance right between leadership and empowering your people. So there's no good empowering everyone if there is no direction. Equally, there's no good giving direction if it's only you giving direction. And so in those, it's that command control sort of balance that you're always trying to strike, and having a really clear structure. This is the body that makes the key decisions and sets the boundaries, and this is the areas where you're empowered to work within those boundaries. It takes a bit of time, particularly when you're running fast at the start, but it's certainly worth investing in that you have staff that are fully engaged on the ground, making decisions and feeling like they're part of the solution, rather than just being dictated to from the top.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We'll leave it there. It is lunchtime. Can I just thank each of you, Charles, Jade, David, for your making time and sharing your insights. Thank you very much.